It was a bright Tuesday morning when Dr. Sarah Mitchell drove her black Mercedes into Atlanta International Airport's private aviation section. The spring sun made her car's polished surface shine as she smoothly pulled into the VIP parking area. At 45 years old, Dr. Mitchell had worked incredibly hard to reach her position as one of the country's top neurosurgeons. Today was especially important. A wealthy patient in Boston needed her expertise for a complicated brain surgery, and they had arranged a private jet to fly her there. Sarah checked her watch. It was 8:30 a.m., giving her plenty of time before her 9 o'clock a.m. departure. She looked at herself in the car's mirror one last time. Her dark skin glowed with natural confidence, and her neat braids were perfectly arranged in a professional bun. She straightened her navy blue blazer and made sure her pearl necklace sat just right. Dr. Mitchell always believed in looking her best, not because she needed to prove anything, but because it was part of who she was. Getting out of her car, she collected her things carefully. In her right hand, she carried a brown leather briefcase containing important medical files and her laptop. Over her left shoulder hung her designer handbag, which held her passport, flight documents, and personal items. Her heels clicked confidently against the pavement as she walked toward the terminal entrance. The private aviation terminal looked different from the main airport. It was smaller, more exclusive, with large glass windows and modern architecture. Several expensive cars were parked nearby, and a few other travelers chatted quietly in the parking lot. A sleek private jet took off in the distance, reminding her that this was just another normal day in her busy life. As she approached the entrance, Dr. Mitchell noticed a security guard standing at his post. He was a middle-aged white man with graying hair, wearing a blue uniform with a badge that read James Peterson. She didn't think much of it at first. She had gone through many security checkpoints in her career, and this was just another one. Dr. Mitchell reached into her bag and took out her identification and flight documents, having them ready before she even reached the door. She had learned over the years that being prepared made everything smoother. In her hand, she held her medical license, pilot passenger documents, and her driver's license, even though she usually only needed to show one or two of these. The morning was peaceful. Birds chirped in the trees near the parking lot, and the air smelled fresh and clean. A gentle breeze moved through the area, carrying the distant sounds of airplanes taking off and landing at the main terminal. Everything seemed perfectly normal, just like any other day in her busy life as a successful doctor. Walking closer to the entrance, Dr. Mitchell noticed how quiet this part of the airport was compared to the main terminal. Only a few other passengers were around, most of them dressed in business attire and carrying similar expensive briefcases. She could see her chartered jet through the terminal's windows, being prepared for takeoff by the ground crew. She thought about her patient in Boston, reviewing the case details in her mind. The surgery would be challenging, but that's why they had called her. She was known for handling difficult cases that other doctors couldn't solve. This would be her third emergency consultation this month, and she felt ready for the challenge ahead. Just before reaching the door, Dr. Mitchell sent a quick text to her assistant back at the hospital, confirming that all her afternoon appointments had been rescheduled. She liked keeping everything organized and making sure no details were overlooked. That's what had made her one of the most respected doctors in her field. The automatic doors were just a few steps away now. Dr. Mitchell pulled her rolling briefcase behind her, already thinking about the flight ahead and the medical case waiting for her in Boston. She had no idea that in just a few moments, her ordinary morning was about to become anything but ordinary. The security guard, James Peterson, watched her approach. His hand moved to adjust his badge, and his stance changed slightly. No one could have guessed that what would happen next would not only change multiple lives, but would also spark a nationwide conversation about prejudice in private aviation security. The moment Dr. Sarah Mitchell reached the terminal entrance, security guard James Peterson stepped directly in front of her. His body language changed from casual to confrontational in seconds. He raised his hand in a stopping motion, even though Dr. Mitchell had already slowed down to show her documents. "Excuse me, ma'am, but you need to head to the main terminal," Peterson said loudly, his voice carrying across the quiet lobby. "This is a private aviation area." He didn't even look at the documents she was holding out. Dr. Mitchell kept her voice calm and professional. "Good morning, sir. I have my documentation right here. I'm scheduled for the 9 a.m. flight to Boston." She tried to hand him her papers, but Peterson took a step back, refusing to even touch them. Listen, I've been working here for 15 years, Peterson said, crossing his arms. I know who belongs here and who doesn't. His eyes moved up and down, taking in her expensive suit and designer shoes with obvious doubt. Behind them, two businessmen walked through a different entrance, and Peterson didn't even turn to look at their papers. Dr. Mitchell noticed this and took a deep breath. She'd faced similar situations before, but it never got easier. Sir, I understand you're doing your job, but I am a neurosurgeon flying to Boston for an emergency consultation. Here are my credentials, flight documentation, and ID. Peterson laughed, a short, harsh sound that made several people turn to look. Right, and I'm the President of the United States. Ma'am, I'm trying to be nice here, but you need to leave. The main terminal is that way. He pointed toward the regular airport entrance, about a mile away. A small crowd was starting to gather. Some people pulled out their phones, while others whispered among themselves. Through the glass walls, Dr. Mitchell could see her chartered plane waiting on the tarmac. She checked her watch. It was 8:40 a.m. now. Mr. Peterson, she said, reading his name tag, I'm going to ask one more time. Please check my documentation. My patient needs me in Boston, and this delay is unnecessary. She kept her voice steady, though her heart was beating faster. Peterson's face turned red. Now you're telling me how to do my job. Ma'am, if you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police. He reached for his radio, making a show of it. Just then, a white couple walked up to the entrance. Without even looking at their papers, Peterson smiled and waved them through. Good morning, folks. Have a nice flight. The couple looked uncomfortable, glancing between Peterson and Dr. Mitchell as they hurried past. So you'll let them through without checking any documents, but you won't even look at mine? Dr. Mitchell asked quietly. She pulled out her phone and started recording. Is there something specific about me that makes you think I don't belong here? Peterson's face got even redder. Are you accusing me of something? That's it. I'm calling security. He grabbed his radio, his hands shaking with anger. More people had stopped to watch now. A young woman in the crowd spoke up. This isn't right. She's just trying to show her documents. But Peterson ignored her. Dr. Mitchell stayed perfectly calm. Years of performing difficult surgeries had taught her how to handle pressure. She noticed an older man in a pilot's uniform watching the scene with a frown. Several other passengers had their phones out, recording everything. Mr. Peterson, she said one last time, I don't want any trouble. I just need to board my flight. My patient in Boston is waiting for emergency surgery consultation. Please, just look at my documents. Security is on their way, Peterson announced loudly, ignoring her words. And you can stop with this doctor story. No one's buying it. He moved to block her view of her plane, as if trying to prove his power over the situation. What Peterson didn't know was that Dr. Mitchell had already sent a quick text to her charter company's representative. She also had the airport security operations center number saved in her phone from previous flights. As Peterson continued his power display, she quietly pressed the call button. She knew that in situations like this, it was better to let the proper authorities handle things. The crowd around them grew larger, and the whispers got louder. The morning sun streamed through the terminal's glass walls, highlighting the tense scene for everyone to see. No one knew that in just a few minutes, everything would change dramatically. The situation at the private aviation terminal was getting worse by the minute. While Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood calmly holding her documents, more travelers started gathering around. Some were openly filming with their phones, while others shook their heads in disapproval at Peterson's behavior. A young businessman in a gray suit stepped forward from the crowd. Sir, I've seen Dr. Mitchell on the news. She's actually a famous surgeon. But Peterson waved him away angrily. Everyone needs to mind their own business. Peterson shouted, his face now bright red with anger. This is a security matter, and I'm handling it. His voice echoed through the terminal, making several people jump. Just then, another couple approached the entrance. They were wearing casual clothes but carrying expensive golf bags. Peterson's whole attitude changed instantly. He smiled broadly and quickly moved to open the door for them. Welcome to the private terminal. Headed out for a golf trip? He asked cheerfully. Dr. Mitchell watched the scene quietly. She held up her phone, still recording everything. Mr. Peterson, in the last 10 minutes, you've let 6 people walk through without checking any documents. I'm the only one you've stopped. Would you like to explain why? Peterson spun around to face her. That's it. You're trespassing and harassing me now. He grabbed his radio again. Security, we have a situation at the private terminal entrance. Need backup immediately. His hands were shaking as he spoke into the radio. More people had joined the growing crowd. A flight attendant from another private jet stopped to watch. She whispered something to her pilot, who immediately pulled out his phone and started making calls. My flight leaves in 15 minutes, Dr. Mitchell said calmly. There's a patient waiting for me in Boston who needs emergency surgery consultation. Every minute you delay me puts their health at risk. She held her medical license higher, but Peterson turned his back on her. An older woman in the crowd spoke up loudly. This is disgraceful. She's shown you every possible document. What more do you want? Others in the crowd nodded in agreement. Peterson's face was now almost purple with rage. All of you are interfering with security protocols, he shouted. If everyone doesn't clear this area immediately, you'll all be dealing with the police. Dr. Mitchell checked her phone. Her text to the charter company had been read, and the Security Operations Center was still on the line, listening to everything. She knew help was coming, but she needed to stay calm for just a few more minutes. A teenage girl in the crowd was live-streaming everything on her phone. This is going viral already, she announced. Over 1,000 people are watching right now. Peterson heard this and seemed to get even more agitated. You can't film me, he yelled, trying to block the cameras with his hands. This is a restricted area, no videos allowed. But it was too late. Dozens of phones were recording his every move. Through the terminal windows, Dr. Mitchell could see her pilot watching the scene. He was on his phone too, looking concerned. The ground crew had stopped preparing the plane and were all staring at the commotion at the entrance. Mr. Peterson, Dr. Mitchell said one final time, her voice still professional and calm, I understand you're upset, but I have every right to be here. I'm asking you one last time to check my documents and let me board my flight. Peterson turned back to her, pointing his finger. You think you're so smart? You think all these people filming will help you? I've worked here for 15 years, and I know exactly who belongs here and who doesn't. Just as he finished speaking, the terminal doors opened behind him. Unknown to Peterson, his words had been clearly heard by the people who had just arrived. The crowd fell silent as everyone turned to look at the new arrivals. Through the glass doors walked 3 people, the head of airport security, the private charter company representative, and the terminal's general manager. Their faces showed they had heard everything. Peterson was still facing Dr. Mitchell, unaware that his supervisors were standing right behind him. The morning sun streaming through the windows illuminated the whole scene like a spotlight on a stage. In the sudden silence, you could hear Peterson's radio crackling with responses he was no longer paying attention to. The next few moments would change everything, not just for Dr. Mitchell and Peterson, but for the entire airport security system. #. The silence in the terminal lasted only a few seconds before the head of airport security, Mrs. Thompson, cleared her throat. Peterson spun around, and his face turned from red to pale white in an instant. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Mr. Peterson, Mrs. Thompson said, her voice sharp and clear. Step away from Dr. Mitchell immediately. She was a tall woman in her 50s, wearing a crisp black suit with a security badge that carried much more authority than Peterson's. The charter company representative, Mr. David Chen, quickly moved to Dr. Mitchell's side. Dr. Mitchell, I am so sorry about this incident. We've been working with you for 3 years now. This is completely unacceptable. He was already pulling out his tablet to show Peterson her flight history. The terminal manager, Mr. Roberts, stepped forward. Peterson, hand over your security badge right now. His voice was firm and left no room for argument. The crowd watched as Peterson's hands shook while unpinning his badge. Dr. Mitchell remained calm and professional, though she felt relieved inside. She turned to Mrs. Thompson and explained, I have all my documentation here. I've been trying to show these to Mr. Peterson for the past 20 minutes. She handed over her papers, which Mrs. Thompson quickly reviewed. Everything is in perfect order, exactly as we would expect from one of our regular private charter passengers, Mrs. Thompson announced loudly. She turned to Peterson, who was now sweating heavily. Would you like to explain why you refused to even look at these documents? Peterson started stammering. I was just following protocols. You see, I thought. His voice trailed off as he realized how weak his excuses sounded. The crowd around them was still recording everything. The teenage girl who had been live streaming spoke up again. This has over 10,000 viewers now. People are really angry about what they're seeing. Her comment made Peterson sink even lower into himself. Mr. Roberts was checking the security cameras on his tablet. I can see here that in the last hour alone, Peterson let through 23 passengers without checking any documentation. Dr. Mitchell was the only one he stopped. His voice was heavy with disapproval. Mrs. Thompson turned to the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Atlanta International Airport, I want to apologize for this incident. This is not what we stand for. She then focused on Dr. Mitchell. Doctor, we'll have you on your way to Boston immediately. 2 security officers arrived to escort Peterson away. As they led him toward the office, he kept looking back, as if he couldn't believe how quickly his power had disappeared. The crowd parted to let them through, many people still filming. Mr. Chen was already on his phone. I'm having the pilot start the engines now. Dr. Mitchell, we'll have you in the air in 10 minutes. He gestured to a VIP escort who had just arrived to carry her bags. The businessman who had spoken up earlier approached Dr. Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell, my wife was your patient last year. You saved her life. I recorded everything today. Would you like a copy of the video for your lawyers? Dr. Mitchell thanked him politely, but turned to Mrs. Thompson instead. I don't want anyone to lose their job, she said quietly. But I do want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Mrs. Thompson nodded seriously. Oh, trust me, doctor, there will be major changes after this. We've needed to update our security training for a while. This incident makes it clear we can't wait any longer. As the crowd began to disperse, many people came up to show Dr. Mitchell their support. The flight attendant who had witnessed everything handed her a business card. I've seen similar incidents before but was afraid to speak up. Would you like my statement for the investigation? Within minutes, a golf cart arrived to take Dr. Mitchell to her plane. As she sat down, she could see Peterson through a window, sitting in the security office, his head in his hands. The morning sun was now high in the sky, and her delayed flight would finally take off. But this incident was far from over. As the golf cart drove her across the tarmac, Dr. Mitchell could already see news vans pulling up to the terminal. The videos had gone viral, and this was just the beginning of a much bigger story. As Dr. Sarah Mitchell's private jet took off from Atlanta International Airport, the story of what happened that morning was spreading like wildfire across social media. Inside the plane, she sat in the comfortable leather seat, finally able to take a deep breath and process everything that had occurred. The flight attendant, Lisa, brought her a cup of hot tea. Dr. Mitchell, I just checked my phone before takeoff. Your story is trending on Twitter and Facebook. People are calling you a hero for staying so calm. Lisa showed her phone screen, where the video had already reached over 1 million views. Back at the airport, things were getting busier by the minute. News vans from local stations CNN, ABC, and Fox had parked outside the private terminal. Reporters in bright-colored blazers stood with microphones, reporting live about the incident. The morning sun made their camera lights seem unnecessary. Inside the terminal's security office, James Peterson sat in a small room with Mrs. Thompson and 2 other security officials. His face was no longer red with anger but pale with fear. The security cameras played on a screen behind him, showing clear footage of him letting multiple passengers through without checks while blocking Dr. Mitchell. In the past hour alone, Mrs. Thompson said, reading from a report, you checked 0 documents from white passengers but stopped 3 black passengers, including Dr. Mitchell. She looked up from her papers. Would you like to explain this pattern? Peterson stared at his hands on the table. I was just trying to maintain security, he mumbled, but even he didn't seem to believe his own words anymore. The evidence was too clear on the security footage playing behind him. Meanwhile, in the main terminal office, Mr. Roberts was dealing with a flood of phone calls. The airport's social media team reported that thousands of people were sharing their own stories of discrimination at airports. Major news networks were requesting statements, and civil rights organizations were calling to offer support. Dr. Mitchell's phone kept buzzing with messages, but she had turned it to silent mode. She needed to focus on reviewing her patient's medical files before landing in Boston. Still, she couldn't help but notice the supportive texts from her sister. You handled that like a queen. Mom and Dad would be so proud. Back in Atlanta, the charter company's office was busy making changes. Mr. Chen called an emergency meeting with his staff. "From today, we're changing our protocols," he announced. "Every VIP passenger will receive a digital ID card with their photo. No more discrimination based on appearance." The teenage girl who had live-streamed the incident, Jenny Martinez, was being interviewed by a local news station. "I just knew I had to record it," she explained. "Dr. Mitchell was so professional, and that guard was so obviously wrong. People need to see that this still happens." In the airport's executive offices, the management team gathered for an emergency meeting. The airport CEO joined via video call, his face serious on the big screen. "This is not just about one security guard," he said. "We need to review our entire security training program." Mrs. Thompson presented a thick folder of complaints that had been filed against Peterson over the past year. Most had been ignored or dismissed. "We found 12 similar incidents," she reported, "all involving minorities being stopped without cause." Outside in the terminal, regular passengers stopped to watch the news reports playing on the airport TV screens. The videos from different angles showed how Dr. Mitchell had handled the situation with grace and professionalism, while Peterson had become increasingly aggressive. Up in the air, Dr. Mitchell's pilot made an announcement. "Doctor, we're making good time to Boston. We should land about 20 minutes ahead of schedule, making up for the delay." She smiled, knowing her patient would still receive the care they needed on time. The flight attendant brought Dr. Mitchell her laptop. "The Wi-Fi is ready if you need it," she said, then hesitated. "My daughter is in medical school, and she looks up to doctors like you. Thank you for showing her how to handle discrimination with dignity." As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, the story continued to unfold below. News channels were now running special reports about discrimination in private aviation. Social media hashtags were trending. Civil rights lawyers were calling the airport. What had started as one woman's experience was quickly becoming a national conversation about change. But Dr. Mitchell remained focused on her primary concern, her patient waiting in Boston. She opened her medical files, knowing that while this incident would have lasting effects, right now she had a life to save. The day after the incident, Atlanta International Airport was buzzing with activity. At 9:00 a.m., exactly 24 hours after Dr. Mitchell's encounter with Peterson, the airport called a major press conference in their main meeting room. The airport CEO, Mr. Richard Wilson, stood at the podium facing dozens of cameras and reporters. Behind him sat Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Roberts, and several board members. Large TV screens showed clips from yesterday's incident, though now the videos had over 50 million views across different social media platforms. "First," Mr. Wilson began, "I want to publicly apologize to Dr. Sarah Mitchell. What happened yesterday was completely unacceptable." He looked directly into the cameras. "Today, we're announcing immediate changes to our security procedures." Meanwhile, in Boston, Dr. Mitchell was leaving the hospital after successfully completing her patient's emergency surgery consultation. As she walked out, hospital staff members stopped to shake her hand. Many had seen the viral videos, and some even asked to take selfies with her. "Dr. Mitchell," a young black medical student called out, "thank you for showing us how to stand up for ourselves with dignity." The student's eyes were filled with tears. "I've been afraid to apply for the private hospital positions, but you've given me courage." Back in Atlanta, Peterson's work history was becoming public. Local news stations reported that 5 other employees had come forward with stories about his discriminatory behavior over the years. Each one described how their complaints had been ignored by the previous management. Mrs. Thompson sat at her desk, reading through hundreds of emails. Many were from other airports across the country, asking about Atlanta's new security training programs. "We can't hide from this anymore," she told her team. "It's time for real change." In the terminal where everything had happened, workers were installing new security cameras and updating the check-in systems. Signs were being put up explaining passengers' rights and the proper security check procedures. Every security guard was wearing a new body camera. The teenage girl who recorded the viral video, Jenny Martinez, had become an overnight sensation. Morning talk shows wanted to interview her. "I just did what was right," she told one reporter. "When you see something wrong, you can't stay quiet anymore." Dr. Mitchell's phone kept ringing with interview requests from major TV networks. Her assistant had to set up a special email just to handle all the messages. But Dr. Mitchell only agreed to one interview with a medical journal about discrimination in healthcare and aviation. At the airport security office, all guards were attending a mandatory emergency training session. The new instructor, a diversity expert, showed them the video of Peterson and Dr. Mitchell. "This is what discrimination looks like," she explained. "And this is why we need to change." Social media couldn't stop talking about the incident. Hashtag #DrMitchellStrong and hashtag #EndAviationDiscrimination were trending worldwide. Celebrities and politicians shared the video, calling for changes in how airports handle security across the country. Peterson himself was facing serious consequences. The airport had fired him, and their investigation found a pattern of discrimination in his work history. He tried giving an interview to defend himself, but his excuses only made things worse. "I was just doing my job," he claimed, but the video showed otherwise. Dr. Mitchell's charter company made big changes too. They created a new VIP passenger app with photos and pre-approved security clearance. "We want all our passengers to feel safe and respected," Mr. Chen announced in a press release. The airport's board of directors held an emergency meeting that afternoon. They approved a $1 million budget for new security training and equipment. "This incident opened our eyes," one board member told reporters. "We can't let this happen ever again." By evening, other airports started calling Atlanta for advice. They wanted to know how to improve their own security procedures. Mrs. Thompson spent hours on conference calls, sharing their new plans and discussing ways to prevent discrimination. As the sun set on this dramatic day, Dr. Mitchell finally returned to her hotel room in Boston. She turned on the TV to find herself on nearly every news channel. But instead of watching, she turned back to her medical papers. Tomorrow she had more patients to help, and that was still her main priority. The story had become much bigger than one incident at one airport. It had started a national conversation about discrimination in aviation, healthcare, and beyond. And it all began because one professional woman stood her ground with dignity and grace. 7 days after the incident at Atlanta International Airport, Dr. Sarah Mitchell sat in her office looking at a stack of letters. Hundreds of people from across the country had written to share their stories and thank her. Her secretary had organized them neatly on her mahogany desk. Dr. Mitchell, her assistant Jenny, called from the doorway. "CNN is here for your first official interview." Dr. Mitchell had waited a week before speaking publicly, wanting to make sure her message would help create real change. The CNN reporter, Maria Santos, sat up in Dr. Mitchell's office. The walls behind them showed Dr. Mitchell's medical degrees and awards. "Your video has now been viewed over 100 million times," Maria began. "How do you feel about becoming a symbol of standing up against discrimination?" Dr. Mitchell thought carefully before answering. "This isn't about me," she said calmly. "It's about changing a system that affects thousands of people every day." She held up some of the letters. "These stories show that what happened to me wasn't unique." Meanwhile, at Atlanta International Airport, big changes were happening. Every security guard now wore a body camera with a clear ID number. New signs in multiple languages explained passengers' rights. Most importantly, 2 security officers always worked together at checkpoints to ensure fair treatment. The airport's new training program had become a national model. Mrs. Thompson spent her days hosting officials from other airports who wanted to learn from Atlanta's changes. "What happened with Dr. Mitchell forced us to face our problems," she told them. "Now we're fixing them." James Peterson's story had taken a different turn. After losing his job, he agreed to appear on a special TV program about bias in security. "I was wrong," he admitted, looking much older than he had a week ago. "Watching those videos of myself, I didn't like the person I saw." The teenage girl who recorded the viral video, Jenny Martinez, had started a social media movement. Her new organization, Record for Rights, taught people how to safely document discrimination. Major civil rights groups offered to partner with her. Back in Dr. Mitchell's office, the CNN interview continued. "What would you say to other professionals who face similar discrimination?" Maria asked. The camera zoomed in on Dr. Mitchell's face as she answered. "Stay professional, know your rights, and document everything," Dr. Mitchell replied. "But most importantly, don't let anyone make you doubt your worth or your right to be somewhere." The charter flight company had made permanent changes too. They created a new system where all VIP passengers received digital IDs with their photos and credentials. Mr. Chen proudly announced that bookings from minority executives had increased by 50% in just 1 week. Dr. Mitchell's hospital noticed changes as well. More minority students were applying for residency programs. Dr. Mitchell showed us we belong in these spaces, one applicant wrote. The hospital board used this momentum to launch new diversity initiatives in their hiring process. Social media kept sharing new stories every day. Hashtag #StandLikeDoc became a popular hashtag for people sharing their own experiences of standing up against discrimination. Dr. Mitchell's calm professionalism had inspired others to document and report unfair treatment. The airport's security office had transformed completely. The walls now showed posters about equality and proper security procedures. Guards attended daily meetings to discuss fair treatment. Mrs. Thompson made sure every complaint was taken seriously and investigated properly. Local schools started inviting Dr. Mitchell to speak to students. She always told them the same thing. Success is the best response to discrimination. Focus on your goals and don't let anyone stop you from achieving them. Peterson's former co-workers were going through intensive training. Many admitted they had seen him discriminate before but hadn't spoken up. "We can't be silent anymore," one guard said during a training session. "Silence makes us part of the problem." That evening, Dr. Mitchell finished reading another stack of letters. One caught her attention. It was from a young black girl who wanted to become a doctor. "You showed me that we can be strong and professional even when people try to stop us," the girl wrote. As the sun set outside her office window, Dr. Mitchell began writing her response to the young girl. She knew that the changes happening now would help create a better future for the next generation. The incident that began as a terrible morning had turned into a powerful movement for change. 3 months after the incident at Atlanta International Airport, Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood on stage at a National Aviation Security Conference in Washington, D.C. The large room was filled with airport managers, security chiefs, and civil rights leaders from across the country. All of them had come to learn about the changes that became known as the Mitchell Standards. Mrs. Thompson from Atlanta Airport stood beside Dr. Mitchell at the podium. Together, they presented the new security training program that had transformed airport security nationwide. On the big screen behind them, numbers told an impressive story. Complaints about discrimination had dropped by 80% at airports that adopted the new standards. "The day I met Dr. Mitchell changed everything," Mrs. Thompson told the audience. "What started as a terrible incident has become a revolution in how we handle airport security." She pointed to the security guards in the room, all wearing new uniforms with body cameras. James Peterson, the former security guard, was also at the conference, but in a different role. He now worked with an anti-bias training company, sharing his story as a warning to others. "I was the perfect example of what not to do," he told a group of security officers. "My bias could have ruined someone's life." Back at Atlanta International Airport, the private terminal looked very different now. 2 security guards, always from different backgrounds, worked together at each checkpoint. Digital scanners verified passengers' IDs, removing personal bias from the process. Signs in multiple languages explained everyone's rights. The teenage girl who recorded the original video, Jenny Martinez, had become a well-known activist. Her Record for Rights organization now had chapters in 50 cities. Dr. Mitchell taught us that documenting discrimination calmly and professionally can lead to real change, she said in her latest TV interview. Dr. Mitchell's medical practice had grown too. More minority patients sought her out, feeling comfortable with a doctor who stood up for equality. Her waiting room walls now displayed news articles about the airport incident, showing patients that they could stand up for themselves too. The charter flight company had seen amazing results from their changes. Their new digital ID system became the industry standard. Mr. Chen proudly reported that their minority client base had tripled. "Dr. Mitchell showed us we needed to do better," he said. "And when we did, our business actually improved." At a special ceremony at the conference, Dr. Mitchell received an award for outstanding contribution to aviation safety and equality. But instead of talking about herself, she invited 50 other people to stand with her, people who had faced similar discrimination and helped create change. "This isn't about one incident or one person," Dr. Mitchell told the crowd. It's about making sure everyone is treated with respect and dignity. The audience gave her a standing ovation, many wiping tears from their eyes. The media coverage had changed too. Instead of just showing discrimination videos, news channels now reported on positive changes at airports. Security guards who handled situations well got public praise. Good behavior became the new viral trend. Peterson's old security office had been completely transformed. New employees watched the incident video during training, learning how bias could cloud judgment. The workshop always ended with a live video call from Peterson himself, showing how people could learn from their mistakes. Dr. Mitchell's original video had become part of training programs beyond airports. Police academies, hospitals, and schools used it to teach about handling discrimination professionally. Her calm response became a model for dealing with difficult situations. The young black girl who had written to Dr. Mitchell months ago was now a regular visitor at her hospital. Dr. Mitchell was mentoring her, along with several other minority students interested in medicine. Success is the best answer to discrimination, she often told them, but helping others succeed is even better. As the conference came to an end, Dr. Mitchell looked out at the crowd. Security chiefs from Europe and Asia had come to learn about the new standards. What happened to her that morning in Atlanta had started a global conversation about respect and equality. 3 months ago, I was just trying to catch a flight, she said in her closing speech. Today, we're changing how people are treated around the world. Remember, every person who walks through your security checkpoint deserves respect. Their dignity is in your hands. The audience stood again, applauding as Dr. Mitchell left the stage. Outside, the evening sun shone on the Washington Monument. Inside, people from around the world were learning how one person's dignity and professionalism could change everything. The Mitchell standards weren't just rules anymore, they were the future of aviation security.